Defending Israel with David Harris on JBS is made possible in part by Barbara and Bob Goodkind, the Paul and Lynn Late Family Foundation to Life to Love, and the Patricia Worthen Allman Foundation.
Hello JBS viewers, I'm David Harris and this is Defending Israel. This week we have another very special guest. I'd like to introduce you to Major Andrew Fox. Andrew spent 16 years in the British military, including 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan and other tours of duty in the Middle East and the Balkans, including a year with United States Special Forces. Since he left the military, he has lectured at the world-famous Sandhurst, the British Royal Military Academy, and he's been a frequent presence on both social media and traditional media, and now serves on the team of the Henry Jackson Society in London. Andrew, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Andrew, let me begin with the fact that you've traveled to Israel on several occasions, particularly since October the 7th. A lot of your speaking and writing has been about Israel and the conflict triggered on October the 7th. What was it in particular that attracted you to this conflict with so many others in the world today, and why have you been so outspoken?
Well, whilst I was serving, I managed to get my master's degree in war studies, focusing on strategy in the Middle East. And then I studied for a second master's in psychology, focusing on the psychology of disinformation and why the brain is susceptible to being lied to. And then, of course, we had a war start in the Middle East with loads of strategic questions and loads of disinformation. So I had plenty to say. So that the academic side of things was the first factor. And the second factor really has been the impact on my very close Jewish friends of what happened in Israel on 7th of October. And the worldwide explosion of anti-Semitism that we've seen since. And I've been very keen to speak up, not on their behalf, but in support of them, to let sort of the Jewish community, particularly in the UK, but wherever the message lands, know that they're not alone in this fight. And there are people that care deeply about fighting anti-Semitism who aren't just from the Jewish community.
You have written that one way of looking at this conflict is to break it down into 3 different segments. The reasons why Israel went to war, the conduct of Israel's war, and its alignment or misalignment with international lawfare. And on all 3, though you're not uncritical of Israel from time to time, you have come down on the side of Israel. Can you take our viewers through each of those sort of 3 lenses briefly?
Yes, of course. So the reasons for war, I think we go back to 7th of October. And I think in many ways the world has lost sight of what actually happened on that day. There's been an awful lot of attempts to downplay it, an awful campaign internationally to sort of try and blame Israel for it, to try and minimize what actually happened. But, I've been down to the Gaza periphery. I've walked in human ashes in Kibbutz Be'eri. I've walked in the room in the Nahal Oz base where I think it was 25 IDF soldiers were burned alive by Hamas. There's just horror after horror. And, you've recapped my military history already. And I have to say that nothing I've ever seen on operations, Afghanistan included, comes close to what I saw in the aftermath of the 7th of October, never mind the massacre itself. No country in the world could possibly be expected to continue with that threat on their borders. And I've also seen intelligence since that they found on bodies from the Nukhba forces on 7th of October, from Hamas's special forces. The plan was clearly to get to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and massacre as many as possible. It was beyond question a genocidal attack. And that is why the war in Gaza is happening in the manner that it is. So that's the first part, justified as far as I'm concerned. The second part, I've spent an awful lot of time with the IDF and looked at their conduct of the war. I've been to the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, which is their Ministry of Defense headquarters, for those who don't know. I've been with Southern Command. I've been with 162 Division. I've been with 96 Division. I've been with 252 Division. I've been into Gaza twice. So I've seen pretty much everything you possibly could see as an outsider in this war. And I've seen nothing that suggests to me there's any kind of plan to violate the law of armed conflict on purpose or to commit a genocide in response to Hamas's attack. Um, and there's elements of it that I've seen that go far and above what I would expect to see in a British or an American headquarters. Things like the Civilian Harm Mitigation Cell, which is a small cell set up to monitor what any part of Gaza looks like on a normal day and compare the levels of civilian population to the present moment. And that's accessible by the entire IDF. It factors into every strike planning process. And again, it's a level of civilian protection that certainly the American army doesn't have, certainly the British army doesn't have. Now, of course, have there been incidents that are potentially over the threshold of criminality in Gaza? Of course there have. I don't think there's ever been a war or an army in history that's fought a conflict where things like war crimes haven't happened. It's the nature of the beast, unfortunately. It's why we have war crimes legislation. We can go back to America and Iraq. We can look at Australia or the UK and Afghanistan, where there are very credible war crimes allegations. That doesn't mean it's systemic. That doesn't mean that the British Army is a war crimes army. It doesn't mean that the US Army is a war crimes army. And by the same token, it doesn't mean that the IDF has a systemic issue with war crimes. This is just what happens in wars, and it's very unpleasant, and it's why you shouldn't start wars, as Hamas did on 7th of October. And then finally, we look at the international space. My first degree before joining the army was actually in law, so that's my third degree. I'm not an international lawyer. I'm not qualified to talk about the ICJ case in huge detail, but I know enough to go through it and understand what I'm reading. The key thing with genocide is the intent. Okay, and yes, some Israeli politicians have said some pretty robust things, particularly if we get down the Ben Gvir Smotrich route. But certainly when it comes to Bibi or when it comes to Yoav Gallant when he was defense minister, there's nothing there that expresses genocidal intent. And in addition to that, there is a huge value to threatening your enemy during wartime. This is a well-known thing, and if we consider some of Gallant's speeches to be genocidal, then we have to go back and consider some of Roosevelt's or Churchill's to be genocidal, because that's the nature of politics in warfare. Of course, the actions on the ground don't match up to a genocide, the false allegations of starvation. I've been to Erez crossing. I've been to Kerem Shalom crossing. I've seen the aid stacked up to go in. It's not an ingress problem, it's a distribution problem, and that's not Israel's problem at this point. That may change. So the entire lawfare cases internationally that we've seen are a farce, and they're part of a politically motivated campaign against Israel. So that is my three sort of headers for this war.
Thanks for that, Andrew. And you said earlier in your opening remarks that one of the motivating factors for you was your Jewish friends and the threat of anti-Semitism. Where does anti-Semitism fit into this picture you're describing?
I think it fits into double standards in this picture. Things are expected of the IDF that aren't expected of any army in the world. For example, the overemphasis on civilian casualties. Now, of course, there are civilian casualties in Gaza. That's not something anyone's denying. But for other armies and other wars, civilian casualties are priced into the fact you have to go to war in the first place. Nobody focuses on how many civilians died during the wars in Afghanistan or Iraq. And even if you go to quite well-researched sites, they can't even give you a figure to the nearest 100,000 how many died in Afghanistan. And yet Israel is supposed to account for every single person that dies in Gaza. And it's just a double standard. That doesn't apply to any other army. So that, to me, is because it's Israel, and Israel is the world's only Jewish state. Therefore, the only conclusion we can draw is that it is anti-Semitism that's driving this.
And in respect to the casualty figures, you made headline news some months ago in a report that you prepared for the Henry Jackson Society that questioned Hamas figures, or shall I say Gaza Ministry of Health, read Hamas figures. Talk to us about the report, how you did your research, and what its impact has been.
Yeah, and it's actually been dragged up to the surface in the last few days because Hamas have released yet another list of names, and that list actually corroborates everything we said in our paper back in December, which is good to see from my perspective that the research holds up and is solid. I think it holds up far better than a number of other reports that go the other way and criticize Israel. But the first thing is we uncovered a huge pattern of errors and mistakes of men listed as women, women listed as men, children have sorry, adults having their ages changed to make them children. And in the most recent release, Hamas themselves have deleted over 3,000 names, including over 1,000 children from their recent updates. And it just goes to show that actually the errors that we found weren't just a handful of errors and mistakes; they were a systemic inaccuracy, which means that the world's media should not have been citing this figure unquestioned. And as an aside, I think it's a real shame that it took a random think tank researcher to do this work that, frankly, the world's media should have been doing from day one before they started reporting this stuff. And I think it's probably one of the greatest failures of journalism and of journalistic standards we've ever seen, ever. I've never come across a failure this endemic and this widespread. The next thing we found was that Hamas consistently conceals combatant deaths. And by that I mean all the names on the list are presented as murdered by IDF action, with no explanation of how they died. Traditionally, over the previous wars in Gaza, Israel's accounting for enemy combatants has turned out every time to be pretty accurate. And at the moment, we're well over the 20,000 mark. So when everyone's citing 50,000 dead, at least 20,000, and I would suggest from our statistical modelling, actually more than that, are Hamas combatants. And that's reinforced by the age demographics. You've heard repeatedly, time and time again, that 70% of deaths are women and children. We've conclusively proved, using Hamas's own figures, that that is nonsense. And actually, by proportion, the vast bulk of deaths are occurring in men of fighting age. And by fighting age, unfortunately, I mean 13 to 45. And we know Hamas, unfortunately, used child fighters, which is yet another war crime to chalk up to their account. And then finally, we sort of debunked the myth that Hamas has always been reliable in the past. I mean, in terms of overall totals, they have been. But what they have always done, and we found social media posts from Hamas encouraging this in the local population, what they've always done is conceal combatant deaths, and they tell Gaza's civilians not to reveal online that a family member who died may have been a combatant. So yes, they're reliable in overall total, but every time they try and hide combatant deaths from the world's media because they're using this figure to bash Israel with in a way that doesn't happen in any other conflict.
For our JBS viewers who have not yet seen the report, Andrew, please share with them how can they access it?
Yeah, it's called Questionable Counting, and you can find it on the Henry Jackson Society website, which is henryjacksonsociety.org.
You mentioned the press, and what you said was this cataclysmic failure to report the story accurately. Why? What explains the failure? Was it intentional? Was it unintentional? What's your thought? And especially when it comes to British media, which in many respects are the global media for the English-speaking audience, beginning, of course, with the BBC.
The why is really tricky. I'd have to get into the newsrooms and ask them myself, but I can make a couple of suppositions. The first one is the 24/7 news schedule now. It makes it incredibly pressured for news networks to get the story out first. And that's amplified, I think, by social media who are regularly ahead of the broadcast and print media that we see, traditional mainstream media, if you will. And in having to try and beat that timeline and that deadline, quite often things that would have happened in the past, like those checks, just aren't happening. And so when Hamas put out a press release saying X thousand dead, and when the UN, of course, are putting that on their website with a small asterisk and then a tiny, tiny font size at the bottom saying unverified, that lends these numbers a credibility they frankly don't deserve. So there's a sort of complicity at the UN level with Hamas in making sure that the media get these figures, and then the media feel pressure to print them immediately. So I think that's part of it. Another part of it, of course, will be an exceptionally well-funded and well-directed campaign by malign actors. Certainly, Iran and Qatar, we can safely say, particularly Qatar through Al Jazeera, have been an absolute well of disinformation in this conflict, particularly if you go to Al Jazeera Arabic, which is a complete sewer compared to the English version, and the English version isn't great. The next factor is the source of journalism coming out of Gaza. Now, Israel, for good or bad, have made the decision that not to allow journalists in, and I understand both sides of the argument here, actually. But the fact that the only people pushing news and footage out of Gaza are Hamas. There's no free journalists in Gaza. There's no brave Arab journalists running around defying Hamas to push out neutral footage. Everything that comes out of Gaza is Hamas. And if that's the only source of information, that's what world journalists are going to lead with. And so they have. And then when we talk about the BBC specifically, there is a very powerful anti-Israel sentiment in the BBC. They keep making mistakes. They pushed out a documentary that featured Hamas royalty that was filmed in Gaza. Just the last week, they sent an email to the Israeli embassy in London asking for a guest for one of their news shows, but they specified that that guest had to be anti-Netanyahu. So they've deliberately done a number of things here that are anti-Israel. Now, there are three parts to an apology. They're saying, I'm sorry. They're saying, it's my fault. And then they're saying, what do I do to make sure this doesn't happen again? And the BBC have been great at paying lip service to the saying sorry, but what they haven't done is accepted the blame, and they haven't accepted that they need to do something differently to stop this from happening. So there's really serious endemic problems with Israel in the BBC, and they are not reporting on this war fairly, which is obviously intensely frustrating to sit by and watch.
But in the meantime, take, for example, Sudan, where almost as a news sidebar, the New York Times has mentioned the threat of genocide, the threat of mass starvation, and yet we rarely hear about the details in Sudan, much less these kind of human interest stories or daily statistical updates. In your view, what explains the difference in the media's attention to Sudan and to Israel and the Gaza conflict?
Yeah, I think the main focus is the fact that Sudan and the Sudanese do not have 60 years of a very well crafted information campaign. It starts for Palestine as it became in the 1960s. It starts in 1964. Prior to that, there was no Palestinian flag. There was no Palestinian people. They were Arabs who'd been displaced from the mandate of Palestine, and Palestinian could be used interchangeably between Jews and Arabs. And then Arafat came in and rewrote the whole narrative and created this fictional beast of Palestine and the Palestinian cause. He was heavily backed by the Soviet Union, and the campaign was very closely targeted on the left-wing fellow travelers of the USSR in Western countries. And that's why you see the Palestinian cause as it is now as a totemic issue for the left very specifically. It's because they have been absolutely the focus of targeted information operations for decades now. And that cause is also exceptionally well funded, as I've said. It's got huge international backing from certain state actors. And they are willing and ready to try and undermine the Jewish state, to try and undermine Israel at every turn. Unfortunately, what Sudan doesn't have is that campaign backing it up, and so it's just loads of dead people without a really heavily pushed agenda to try and beat down another country, which again is an absolute travesty because the world should know about Sudan. It should know about those hundreds of thousands of dead people, and it should be generating pressure on the international stage to try and get that massacre stopped.
And Andrew, in the meantime, last year we had a change of government in Britain, and with the change of government in Britain, we had a change of policy towards Israel and the conflict. And I'm not asking you to choose sort of partisan sides, but analytically, as an expert on warfare and its psychology and its ramifications, what explains this change in British policy?
I think it's relatively straightforward. Unfortunately, there is a large population in the UK who were particularly galvanised by the propaganda. And Labour lost, I think it was 5 seats in the last general election, including John Ashworth in Leicester, who was supposed to be a government minister and suddenly found himself out of a job. and these five heavily Muslim electorates elected five members of parliament based on Gaza and Gaza alone, and quote unquote stopping the genocide. And I think Labour is scared of that part of their electorate. They traditionally heavily rely on Muslim votes, and they are doing absolute lip service to try and be able to say to that part of their electorate that they've been tough on Israel. I don't think they especially have. They've not been helpful. They've stopped their opposition to the ICC case. They've stopped a very tiny proportion of arms sales that will have had no impact on the war whatsoever. And obviously they've been beating a drum about a ceasefire ever since they got into power. But all it's really achieved is burning any British influence in Israel that we might have had. Now, the UK and Israel have never been especially easy bedfellows since 1948. We've been friends at times, and we've been slightly more antagonistic at times. So we've never been Israel's most steadfast ally. But I had a meeting with Bibi back in July, and when our Foreign Secretary David Lammy's name came up, Bibi just smirked. You know, it's deeply embarrassing actually from a British perspective how poorly Labour have set out to sort of kowtow to a small part of the electorate, and in doing so have actually seriously damaged our influence on the world stage. It's been very poor politics from them, I would suggest.
And recently, we have a new administration in Washington. You may have noticed. And President Trump has taken, in some respects, a radically different approach to the conflict, including a proposed solution in Gaza. How have you reacted to the American approach more generally, and more specifically to that idea that he put on the table?
I mean, globally, I think it's desperately sad that America is now no longer an ally for us. I think that's a real shame, and it's throwing away the baby with the bathwater, quite honestly. I think there's an awful lot of benefits that could have come to America from being allies. I mean, just look at the Greenland situation. America's only got 2 icebreakers. Denmark has plenty more. Finnish make loads. The Canadians have plenty. You know, if allyship had been continued, Trump could have achieved everything he wants in Greenland through friendship rather than animosity. But that's that's a slightly different policy issue. When it comes to Israel, Mr. Trump has been very strong. I think it's I can understand why my Israeli friends are so happy with his policies thus far. And I think also we're finally seeing a White House that is taking the Middle East holistically as a problem, rather than looking at Yemen and Lebanon and Syria and Iran and Gaza as different problems. They're finally starting to look at things connectedly. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the airstrikes in Yemen on the Houthis happened just a day or two before Israel then were able to re-engage in Gaza with more serious firepower. I think that was coordinated, and I think that's really useful. But that's not to say I don't think Mr. Biden had a horrendous war. He had domestic pressures that he had to kind of pay lip service to as well. There were a few pauses in fighting and a few kind of slowing downs of operations due to White House pressure, which weren't ideal. But I think, you know, Mr. Biden comes out of it broadly okay, but Mr. Trump has certainly turbocharged efforts in the Middle East. The question is whether or not it'll work. Hamas are not rational actors. I think any other rational actor would have surrendered at this point. They would have released the hostages and surrendered. But Hamas is not rational. They see deaths in Gaza as a good thing, both for civilians and themselves. They want to be martyred. They want to see Israel's reputation continue to be damaged on the world stage. And they're thinking in generations here. They're not thinking in the short term of what's best for the people of Gaza or best for their own individual careers. So it's a slightly strange position. I think Israel's going to keep grinding away, and we'll see what happens over the next weeks.
And Andrew, we have just a few minutes left, but I want to ask if President Trump were to invite you into the Oval Office, and in particular if he were to refer to your own writing, which suggests that the crux of the matter in the Middle East begins in Tehran. Mm. And the funding, as you've mentioned in this program, begins in Doha, in Qatar. What ought to be American-led policies toward Iran and Qatar, from your perspective, that could change the regional outlook?
It's really tricky with Qatar because we've allowed them to buy so much, including reserve currency. I mean, Qatar, if put under pressure, could crash the dollar tomorrow. just by selling their reserve stocks. There's a really serious problem with Qatar, and it's a far more complicated and difficult one to solve. Iran, I think the bottom line here is they cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon, and that's the red line. They're incredibly close to it. They're within 1 week of achieving that, and that is a real problem. It's easier to say than to deal with though, because the sites are spread out, they're deep underground. We would have to make sure we knew where everything was and hit it simultaneously so that Iran wasn't left afterwards with enough working equipment left to sprint towards that warhead, because that changes everything in the Middle East. Regime change in Tehran is far more challenging, because even if you say decapitate Khamenei and his regime, what comes next is always a big question. And I think that's the golden lesson from 2003 onwards. It's all very well removing heads of state in the Middle East, but quite often what comes next can be worse. So we'd have to be cognizant that Iran has half a million men under arms for the regime. They're no good as an offensive threat, but there's certainly enough of them to keep the Iranian population cowed. So I'm far more reticent to encourage regime change than I am to talk about removing their nuclear threat, making sure we do it properly, and then just sanctioning them to the point where hopefully the regime collapses internally and something else can come in its place.
And as we talk about Iran and Qatar, is Turkey getting away with murder, literally and figuratively?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. And it's really awkward that they're a NATO member. That is causing real problems with the alliance as well. Never mind the fact I don't think America would respond to an Article 5 call right now. I don't think Turkey would either. And we're seeing their actions in Syria. We're seeing escalating tensions with Israel. I know from friends I've spoken to in the intelligence space in Israel that Turkey certainly had an involvement with Hamas in 7th of October and in training suicide bombers to go into Israel. That was found on Sinwar's servers. So Turkey's a real problem. They've been responsible for the worst group.
Wait, can I interrupt you for a moment? You just said Turkey had a role in training suicide bombers that entered Israel on October 7th. Stay on that point for just another moment, Andrew, because that's a headline here.
Okay, so this is secondhand from a source in Israel. When they went through Sinwar's servers after they found them after his death, they found troves of documents, and some of those point towards Turkish involvement with Hamas and in their training people for 7th of October. Now, the critical point here is, of course, that this is Muslim Brotherhood territory, so it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. We know the Muslim Brotherhood and the way they operate is that Turkey provides the arms, Qatar provides the funding, and the Egyptians certainly have a degree of intelligence that they share over the border. So Hamas have always been a Muslim Brotherhood organization, and it shouldn't be any shock to anyone that Turkey has been deeply involved with nefarious actions against the state of Israel. But yeah, also in Syria, they're backing the SNA, the Syrian National Army, who are by far and away one of the worst groups when it comes to atrocities. And they're the ones who've been pounding the Kurdish positions in the north and east of Syria for the last however many months. So Turkey is, I think, filling the void that Iran has left. I think that's the natural step here. If we look at how the Shia crescent with Iranian proxies has now collapsed, that leaves a vacuum, and Turkey and Qatar are looking to make it the Muslim Brotherhood crescent instead. And I think that is probably strategically the next biggest threat to Israel in months and years to come.
Andrew, unfortunately, very unfortunately, our time is up. I have lots more questions, and this has been a fascinating discussion, so thank you very much. JBS viewers, you've been listening to Major Andrew Fox, 16-year veteran of the British military, including special operations from Afghanistan to the Middle East to the Balkans. Keen observer of events, as you've just seen. Please follow him on social media as well. Andrew, again, thank you. And JBS viewers, this is David Harris, defending Israel, and looking forward to seeing you again next week.